The Coronavirus Command Council held an urgent meeting yesterday as concerns mount over the rapid increase in COVID-19 infections. There are expectations that stricter restrictions will be announced in days to come, but authorities are fighting a tight-roped approach when President Cyril Ramaphosa will be addressing the nation. Now, to discuss the possible impact of regulatory changes, I'm joined by political economist Mandla and Dr. Sthembile Mbete, a senior political science lecturer at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Sthembile, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That line doesn't seem to hold, but we hope it will hold throughout this conversation. Mandla, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I'll start with you. And the simple question at the top of everyone's mind is right now, what are the chances of harsh lockdown restrictions as we saw with level 5 and level 4? Can we afford it?
Well, I certainly think we can't go back to level 5, level 4. I don't think it would be the right decision. I don't think the case for lockdowns in terms of curbing the virus has been proven. But certainly with our economic challenges, there's no chance that we're going to go back to such a strict lockdown approach. There really are no easy answers, though. The government is trying to balance, of course, regulations to try to curb the spread, while, of course, not trying to disrupt the economy. We've already seen with the closure of beaches was a gut punch to the tourism industry. So I think we're going to see calibrated regulations, probably crackdowns on large gatherings, bars, taverns, those kind of indoor party environments where there's people in close proximity. But I suspect that we're not going to see a return to the strictest lockdown approach.
Dr. Sthembile, does Cyril Ramaphosa, his Coronavirus Command Council and his cabinet have the political capital at least to go back to some sort of harsher measure? We can't afford it economically, Mandla just told us, but does he have the political room to maneuver such regulations?
Look, I certainly think that the way in which the Coronavirus Command Council is now operating, where there is there's a far greater intergovernmental approach. So it is no longer just the national government, but also provincial premiers and executives, as well as local government that are involved in the decision making, has enhanced the legitimacy of the decisions that are made by the National Coronavirus Command Council, at least certainly within amongst the leadership at the different levels of government. I do think that a challenge that President Ramaphosa's government is going to face is the legitimacy of harsher measures within the general public. I think that what we've seen, and certainly with the spread of the second wave of the coronavirus, is that many people in the public seem to be COVID fatigued and no longer really adhering to the restrictions. And I think that part of that is that you've stopped seeing the kind of communication that you saw early on in this crisis from the government about what measures should be, but also what the logic of the government is around the different measures. So the last time that the president addressed us, he seemed to announce a kind of level 1 plus, which led to a lot of questions about what had happened to the government's risk-adjusted strategy. That strategy was introduced as providing a logic for how restrictions would be scaled up or down depending on the spread of the novel coronavirus, but it seems to have been sort of chucked out.
Let's touch on that point there. You mentioned earlier on in your answer that the approach has now moved from a top-down approach where the president imposes restrictions to one that's more consultative and sort of bottom-up, where mayors, councillors, premiers and MMCs get to suggest to the president what they think will work best for their province, their city, their district, and the president sort of gives them room to maneuver that. And then you say the communication strategy has sort of also changed, where we don't see a lot of communication as we saw in the earlier days of the coronavirus. Do you think that mayors and premiers have done enough to take over that frontline communication role from the president, given that they now have more room to make recommendations to the president as to what would work best for them?
No, I don't think that they have done enough. And I think that, the point that Mandla was making earlier about us not being able to go back to a very harsh lockdown, I think that our discourse as a country has become sort of polarized between either a harsh lockdown or nothing. But there's a whole lot in between those two extremes that I don't think that the government at all the different levels have explored sufficiently. So,
Such
for
as?
example, there is scope for localized restrictions and localized measures that I don't think we've taken advantage of to deal with hotspots. The second thing is that all of the other measures like tracking and tracing, proper testing measures, those combis, those converted vehicles that were going through townships at the beginning of the crisis, testing people, tracing what's happened to all of that infrastructure. We don't actually know, and how it's being managed. And then the third thing is that even the regulations that are already in place don't seem to be properly enforced, and particularly those that should be done at municipal level, at bylaw level. So, for example, the restaurants and people sitting in restaurants without masks and at full capacity, that doesn't seem to be policed in any way, and that would be the responsibility at a more localized level than a national one.
So restaurant owners in the city of Cape Town, Mandla, should blame the city of Cape Town for not enforcing bylaws if they have to close up again.
Well, certainly it has to be a partnership, right? I mean, we can't have sort of a nanny state approach where we're all going to behave irresponsibly and then rely on, the police to enforce those situations. Business has been saying they're a responsible partner, so it's the responsibility of each sector to contribute to the solution. I think an important point that Sthembile just raised is that very often in South Africa, we think of the solution to coronavirus as being about these lockdown regulations, which again is a very blunt, heavy-handed approach, which actually hasn't been proven to be effective. The countries that have been most effective in the world, South Korea, Taiwan, Germany. Think about the fact that South Korea, Taiwan, look at their proximity to China, very low levels. At least in Taiwan, South Korea had a spike, but has kept it contained. Their success has been based on exactly what Dr. Mbete just raised: contact tracing, testing, rigorous testing, being able to see where are the flare-ups coming from, what are the kind of activities that are resulting in these flare-ups, and then being able to address them, and then track the people that go home and make sure that they don't cause flare-ups where they're in their destinations.
So at the start of the lockdown, we went into a 21-day lockdown, right? And we thought, hey, we're just going to wait this out and I'll be back at work pretty soon. And 10 months later, no, you're not back at work. And we think, oh, once the vaccine is here, we'll be good. We'll be back at work pretty soon. But no, we won't be. We won't be able to afford enough of the vaccine to inoculate enough people in the country so that we don't have this problem anymore. So we're going to be here for a while. Some estimates are that we're going to be stuck in here for 3 years. Some saying 5 years if we're lucky. Have we started planning for living with coronavirus for that long?
I'd have to say no, right? Unfortunately, I want to be fair because this is a very tough problem. Obviously, it hit us out of the blue, but I don't think our leadership have shown a really strong ability to engage in that kind of planning. I mean, we've seen that this is completely reshaping our societies and our economies. Work patterns are different, industries are changing. And for instance, for us as a very tourism-dependent country, that being one of our industries that we're looking for to propel growth and employ large numbers of people, this is going to reverberate over time. So we certainly need to get on the ball with that. This has completely rechanged things like commercial real estate, more people working from home. That's changing all sorts of things. And so we do have to come up with a proactive plan because we simply cannot have, for example, a tourism industry that is basically disrupted in this way for years to come. If we're gonna recover from this in 2 to 3 years, as opposed to 5 to 7 years, as the worst predictions in terms of getting back to where we were before this crisis, which even then wasn't even in a good place, we're absolutely gonna have to come up with smarter approaches to doing this. Because if we're gonna be closing beaches, closing bars and taverns, I mean, why would anyone want to come here during our peak festive period? Closing wine estates, these are our big selling points. So we're going to have to find a way to work together, not just as government, but as business, as citizens, to manage this crisis and be able to operate safely in order to function.
Dr. Mbete, have policymakers, legislatures in Parliament and in different provinces, have they started asking themselves, how do we write new laws and new policies for the next 5 to 7 years that take into account that we might be living in the state of inconvenience?
No, I don't think that they have. And I think that I think that we're going to reach the expiry date of using the National Disaster Framework in order to deal with this COVID-19 crisis. Over the past few months, government has been using the National Disaster Act the Disaster Management Act, in order to manage the crisis. But as it looks like it's going to be a far more long-term, or at least a medium-term situation for us to deal with, we're going to need to have other kinds of measures put in place in order to create the framework for managing the crisis. I just want to, highlight two countries that I think have managed this crisis excellently with limited resources, just like we do. Vietnam, which is a neighbor of China's, and out of a population of 95 million, has had less than 40 deaths from COVID-19. And Senegal, in our own continent, which has dealt incredibly well with COVID-19, minimizing infections and minimizing deaths through communication, through openness, through having proper testing and contact tracing mechanisms. And I do think that our government has looked very far afield for models on which to deal with this crisis, when it actually should be looking closer to home on the African continent at countries that have dealt with outbreaks and pandemics such as this.
Dr. Sthembile Mbete, thank you so much. Mandla, I wish we had more time. I really do want to speak about, and hopefully we can continue this conversation pretty soon. I really do want to speak about what economic frameworks we need to start looking, what the tools are available for us. One, to plan for growth. One, that's to say, how do we recover from the debt burden that we have? But two, how do we use the resources we have to, inspire the economy of growth as far as manufacturing is concerned, exports and imports are concerned, and what relationships do we need to look at to make that happen? But we have unfortunately run out of time.